Welcome to the Bible in a Year podcast, a resource from Enter the Bible. Journey with us through the books of the Bible, discovering more about Scripture and how it shapes our lives today. I'm Kristofer Phan Coffman.
And I'm Kathryn Schifferdecker.
Today we're joined by our friend and colleague, Cameron Howard, who is professor of Old Testament at Luther Seminary and the author of The Old Testament for a Complex World. And she's here to tell us about the book of Lamentations.
So today, as Kristofer said, we're talking about Lamentations, which is probably one of those books that is lesser known, at least in Christian circles. Maybe, I know better known in Jewish circles. But how would you sum up the message of the book of Lamentations, just briefly?
Lamentations is, first of all, poetry. So it shows rather than tells. It expresses feelings. It gives us very vibrant imagery. So it's poetry, and it's lament poetry in particular. It is expressing grief and sadness. So it is set, or it seems to be describing the period of the siege of Jerusalem by Babylon in the months leading up to the exile in 586 BCE. So it's poetry that describes the horrors of siege warfare. Yeah. So sometimes is very, very graphic, and its basic question, and I think it really doesn't have a message as much as it wrestles with a question. Mm-hmm. Is God here in our suffering? Yeah. Has God abandoned us?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of talking about it. A question at the heart of it.
And so what kind of book is this?
So it's a collection of poems, but more specifically, lament poems, but even more specifically, these poems, the first four at least. And so there are 5 chapters in Lamentations, and I would talk about each chapter as a poem in and of itself. So 5 poems. And the first 4 are acrostic poems. That is, each stanza begins with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet. There are 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and there are 22 verses in Lamentations 1, corresponding each stanza to a different letter of the alphabet. Also 22 verses in chapter 2 and chapter 4. And chapter 3 has 66 verses. And so it puts that acrostic in triplicate. And so in that way, these first 4 in particular chapters of the 5 of Lamentations are very rigidly structured lament poems.
And could I ask a follow-up on that?
Yeah.
The very long one, does it go Aleph, 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 Beit, Beit, Beit?
Yes.
Or, okay. So not 3 times through the alphabet, but 3 verses for each letter.
Right.
Okay.
It expands each letter.
So what is the basic context? You've already mentioned it's written during the siege of Jerusalem in the months 587, 586, when Jerusalem is destroyed by the Babylonians. Well, at least it's remembering that time. When was it actually written, and who was it written for?
Yeah, those are great questions that I don't know the answer to.
Yeah.
That is
like much of the Bible.
Right. Traditionally, Lamentations is associated with Jeremiah. So in the canon, it comes, in the Christian canon, it follows the book of Jeremiah, because Jeremiah, the prophet, also wrote laments. And so it was thought same time that Jeremiah is doing his prophesying, and same situation, and it's lament poetry, so maybe Jeremiah wrote it, but there's nothing internal to the book of Lamentations that suggests that he did. And yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult to say. I mean, it would be a scribal audience. There wouldn't be a lot of people who could read. In that sense, it would be the sort of upper class. There's a lot of talk there about, princes hung by their hands. I mean, this idea, again, it's very graphic, but this idea that the leadership of Jerusalem is humiliated and is gone, but you also in Lamentations have a lot of observations about, the poor people because siege warfare is about starvation, right? You can't get things into or out of the city, and so the people starve. So it's really just this outpouring of grief and a kind of naming of the horrors of that time.
Well, on that note, we come to that time in the podcast when we talk about Bible bingo. And so here you've given us 5 concepts or words or people that as you read through the book of Lamentations are on your bingo cards. We'll go through them in quick succession, starting with Daughter Zion.
Yeah, so Jerusalem is personified as a woman, Daughter Zion, particularly in chapters 1 and 2. And so one thing you'll notice as you read the book of Lamentations is that the voice who is speaking jumps around a bit. And so you have Daughter Zion being spoken about at the beginning, and then Daughter Zion or a sort of first person voice then talking about Daughter Zion in chapter 2. But this idea, this personification of Zion as a woman happens a lot in the prophetic books as well. It's a sort of a common motif. And that way, then the destruction of Jerusalem is described in this very kind of embodied way. So, yeah, look out for the metaphor of Daughter Zion throughout Lamentations.
And from Daughter Zion, you move to strong man, but you've got it in quotation marks. So we got strong man going on.
Yeah. So then as these voices are jumping around, you have this first person, so speaking with I language, voice in chapter 3 of I am the man who has seen affliction under the rod of God's wrath. So here you have this first person. He's described. He's a strong man. That's Kathleen O'Connor's. She's a biblical scholar who's written wonderful books on Lamentations and Jeremiah. Refers to this narrator, this voice of chapter 3 as the strong man. And so it's again giving this individual lament, sort of one person's voice describing the despair of the suffering of the city. So I put the strong man there just to tune your ear to the change in voice that is kind of sometimes hard to keep track of in Lamentations.
Oh, thank you. So Daughter Zion, strong man, and then we've talked about this a little bit already, but bingo number 3, poetry.
Yeah, just don't forget it's poetry. So, yeah, poetry shows, not tells. Poetry has this way of using metaphor, comparing one thing to another to describe something that's very difficult to find words for with other images that are easier to understand. And so as you read, pay attention to how the author uses imagery, uses metaphor in order to try to give voice to what is so difficult to name, that is the depth of their suffering.
Oh, thank you. Which leads us into number 4, affliction.
Yeah, this is kind of a bummer of a list, but
well,
I mean, that's the nature of Lamentations.
That is the book. That is the book.
It's sadness all around. But notice how many, even in English, how many synonyms for affliction you find there. Affliction, despair, malice,
trouble.
Yes. Yeah, it's a helpful exercise to see how many different ways. And again, I've said this already, but just the desire of the author to find the words for something there are no words for.
Yeah.
How do you talk about something so horrible? And so then this turning to poetry, turning to imagery, turning to a whole thesaurus worth of synonyms for terror and despair are the strategies they're using.
And from there, for number 5, we end with unless ...
Yes. When I have it there, it makes me think of the end of the Dr. Seuss book, The Lorax, right? Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. This is a very different unless than that. So lament poems often end with doxologies. That is, after naming all of the ways that the speaker is suffering and this concern about where God is in the midst of this suffering, they often then end with this word of praise. But we know, Lord, you reign forever. Your throne endures to all generations. And there's this hope at the end. But Lamentations does not end with hope. It ends with unless, or maybe, but instead. There's this turn at that word, which is at the beginning of verse 22 of chapter 5. The very end of chapter 5. And by the way, chapter 5, it has 22 verses, 22 stanzas, but it does not follow the acrostic format, which has led some scholars to talk about how the structure of the poem disintegrates under the weight of the grief that it is expressing. But it says, so verses 21 and 22, "Restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry beyond measure." Angry with us beyond measure. So this is the possibility that ends Lamentations, not the stuff about how God is powerful and his throne reigns forever, as you get in verse 19. But with this, maybe God really is so angry at us that God has abandoned us. Or maybe God is simply absent. Maybe the relationship is broken. And it ends on that despair. And that is, it's a kind of terrifying ending in some ways, right? There is no good resolution at the end to the theology of Lamentations. There's no clear promise.
Well, thank you for playing Bible bingo, Cameron. It is, you said there's a lot of words for affliction and despair, but you're right, that is the book, and the honesty of it is helpful, I think, for those times when we may have, not that we, I hope none of our listeners have been in a BC city, but when we encounter trouble too. All right, another question. What's weird or interesting about the Book of Lamentations?
So I think that what I had in mind for that one is that acrostic structure that I've already described. So I won't sort of re-describe that. You know, when I think acrostics, I think about the poems that I wrote in like the 4th grade, where I'd write my name and then you'd write adjectives, you know, Cameron, and like C, caring, you know, sort of thing. But the acrostic poem may have been a kind of scribal training exercise, because that, I mean, just to get back to the idea of something in school, right, that helps you with your letters and think about different words to start. But I think it takes a very different turn in Lamentations. So it is just an interesting choice for this kind of poetry.
That is very interesting. You touched on this a little bit already, but why is this book important for Christian life and theology?
I think in the same way that lament psalms are important, in that it gives voice to the talking back to God. It makes anger at God, right, biblical. It says God is held to account for human suffering, that human beings want to hear from God, you know, that God is here, that God cares about our suffering, both for individuals and for communities. You know, by raising this possibility, you know, God's going to turn this around unless God has abandoned us. I think it allows us today to say those things. That's not the last word of the Bible. It's the last word of one book of the Bible, but it's certainly not the only witness to God's presence or lack thereof in suffering. And so understanding that as an important part of our tradition. I mean, I think about, you know, there's some hope for me in this idea that Lamentations calls out the possibility that God is a tyrant, because by saying that God might be a tyrant, it shows God isn't a tyrant. Because tyrants want to hear only good things about themselves, right?
Yeah.
They want to hear only the positive news, to be praised. And this idea that our tradition includes this sort of shaking the fist at God, I think is really powerful evidence that God is not the tyrant that some of these psalms and laments fear that God could be.
That's a really lovely point, Cameron. Like God doesn't want just yes men or yes women, right? God invites the lament, even,
right?
or listens to the lament. The wrestling, yeah. So what's a maybe a personal story, a way that you see your story in this book, or a way that you relate to this book of Lamentation?
Well, again, I may have gotten ahead of myself because I think it's precisely that openness to questionings. In Lamentations, maybe less so, but certainly in a lot of the other lament psalms, there's this reminding God of the great things God has done in the past. You, O Lord, are powerful, and here are the ways that you have done. And it does do this especially at the end of chapter 2. Here are the things we know you can do. And so show up and do them.
Right.
And that ability to cry to God, to not just accept human suffering as a part of life that's sort of inequitably distributed among people. That is a question that the tradition has to wrestle with. And I think that's where a lot of my faith actually blossoms best, is in that ability to do that questioning. And so I appreciate the witness of Lamentations as raising those difficult questions in this situation of very, very profound suffering.
Well,
thank you, Cameron.
Thank you. I wish for our closing we had asked you to write an acrostic poem about Lamentations.
I should have thought of that. That would have been clever.
But instead, we'll ask you, can you or will you describe this book for us in 7 words or less?
How long, O Lord, and why? So the question, it's the question, the describing of the suffering and the wondering, how long is it going to last? And especially, why has it happened?
So, Cameron, in your responses before we started recording, you have another 7 words or less that I actually really like a lot as well. Yeah. I like how long, O Lord, and why. But can you tell us the alternate as well?
Yes, the other one. I didn't want to be too flippant with so profoundly sad a book, but are you there, God? It's me, Zion. So again, this communal lament. That's given voice in different ways. Asking, are you there, God? It is, that's a sort of play on that Judy Blume book, Are You There, God? It's me, Margaret.
Right.
But it is this, right, there's some irony or something in the idea that you're praying the prayer, are you there? Because if not there, then why pray? But if you are there, there seems to be this affirmation that Anyway, I think that's happening in Lamentations, if I may be anachronistic and pull in Luke, right? I believe, help my unbelief. Like that there's this this idea that there's this hope and this desire, but also this doubt that's all mixed together there.
Yeah, I just love that. I mean, again, how long, O Lord, and why? It's exactly right. But are you there, God? Is really a central question. And it's me, Zion. Like, remember me? Remember all those promises? I just think that's really, it's clever, but it's also just really lovely. So thank you for that, Cameron. And thank you for opening up the Book of Lamentations for us and our listeners.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Well, and thank you to those of you who have listened to this podcast. This has been the Bible in a Year podcast from Enter the Bible. Check out more great resources on the Bible at enterthebible.org. We have entries, essays on every book of the Bible. We have more podcasts. We have blog posts. We have maps, all kinds of things. Whether you're listening on your favorite podcast app or watching on YouTube, we appreciate you following with us. Thank you so much. You can get, again, great resources like this, more conversations, courses, anything that you would need as you dive in and enter the Bible with curiosity and faith. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please rate and review or like and subscribe. And of course, as always, the very best compliment you can pay us is to share this podcast with a friend. Until next time.